Okay. All right. We're very happy to have Peter Fritzsche here again with us. Peter Fritzsche is the W.D. Sarah Trowbridge Professor of History at the University of Illinois. He's the author of several previous, well, 11 books on Germany and Hitler and Nazism, including Hitler's First Days and the award-winning Life and Death of the Third Reich. He's the author of a new book published by Basic 1942 when World War II engulfed the globe. Now, Peter, why pick 1942? Why concentrate on that as a year to look at World War II as opposed to other years?
Well, 1942 is the year, but my 1942 starts with Pearl Harbor and ends with December 7th, 1941, and it ends with Stalingrad, so the end of January 1943. But 1942 is the year that the war really became global. All the protagonists were in. The sides were set up. The only two major belligerents that did not fight each other was Japan and the Soviet Union, but otherwise everybody's in. At the same time, a single year allows me to take a world tour,
Mm,
whereas if I had more and more years, I really couldn't look at the actual global span and the global scale. And 1942 is a year in which it's not clear who's going to win. Indeed, in the summer of 1942, it looked like the Axis powers might win. The fact that the result is uncertain allows me to really peer into the nature of the war, the how, instead of the end. And it's all uncertain in 1942, and it gives me the focus on all the various conflicts are there, rather than running everything through the end point of 1945 and then Hiroshima, and then all the other secondary or what I call the second fronts tend to get lost. So 1942 brings them all into focus. The multivalent, multifarious nature of this war that at the time people thought would never end.
mm, mm. Now, one thing that's been going on, before we get into the substance of the book, there's been all these conferences about the meaning of World War II, the 80th anniversary of World War II. At Columbia, just the past week, there was the final part of a conference that had started in Europe, which was looking first in Paris at the colonial aspects of World War II, the post-war impact of it. Then in Berlin, there was a conference associated with this, looking at intra-European conflicts. And then the last conference was sort of looking at, okay, what's the meaning of the war? And the last panel they had that had Arnie Westad from Yale, Adam Tooze from Columbia, several people who had been involved in the State Department or National Security Council of Biden and Obama. The whole emphasis of that was essentially the whole post-World War II order has collapsed. And the questions you raise in your book, particularly in the last chapter, you have a very interesting comment about what are we talking about these days? We're talking about people's wars, not the people's war. And I was wondering if you could talk about, before we get into the substance of 1942, your feelings about the whole meaning of the war these days. Because if you talk about refugees, you also make a comment about climate change. And we all know that one of the reasons why we're having this issue of people in the United States is due to climate change and the displacement that is going to do globally in every rational study we've looked at about people having to move instead of being moved, in some cases by war and conflict and climate change. So, what's the meaning of World War II now in our time now? And of course, look at what's going on in the United States. You know, the constant battles of fascism, Nazism, the way the Trump administration is reacting to everything. You live in Illinois, so you guys are experiencing this militarization domestically of the politics of our country. So, what's the meaning of the war now in your mind to everyone or what are the complexities of that?
Jim, the answer to that is that there's in a way there's two nows. that you're referring to. The first now is when I conceived the book, which was in 2019. And the now in 2019 was very much to link what I thought was a war without end. The disaster that doesn't happen. There's no Hiroshima. It's a war without end in 1942 that has something to do with 2042, exactly as you outline, a series of fears, resentments, anxieties about global movements that are spurred on by climate change and economic inequality, and a kind of a new parochialism as neighborhoods, communities, nations fend for themselves rather than reach for international agreements. And that was the now that I was referring that inspired the book. This is a now before COVID, and it is a now, and COVID to me completely uh, erased climate change and as a global issue, and then the new administration that we have in 2024. And so when one talks about the Columbia Conference and the collapse of the post-war order, that's another now. That's a later now in which the legitimacy of international treaties and international alliances and international conventions is cast into doubt and is completely disputed. Their legitimacy is completely disputed, which means we're talking about the moral basis of World War II. And those two need to be separated. I still believe that if we're looking at 2042, my book has a great deal to say. I think we will be talking about uh, self-defensive measures that nations, communities, neighborhoods undertake in a parochial way, that we are looking at a set of zero-sum calculations about survivalism, in which international cooperation is subordinated. But right now, in 2024, we also have the destruction of the legitimacy of the post-World War II order and any kind of sense of good practices, friendship, alliance, the memory of World War II, the sacrifices of the soldiers, but also the massacres and the genocides that are embedded in that war. That memory is being evacuated in a completely sort of transactional, day-to-day conception of how power is built and understood. And so it's a world right now, from the administration's point of view, really without memory, without history, without commitment, without soul. For all the problems of the post-World War II order, though there was soul. And if I had to rewrite anything in the book, I would defend the idea of the good war to some extent. But my overall message, the one that I conceived in 2019, holds that we're not looking at the end of the world, a war that ends the world. We're looking at a world in which war will be increasingly endless.
Interesting. Now, one thing that's important in your book is that it's a great book, by the way. I enjoyed reading it thoroughly. Um, is the issues that many people ignore in their focus on World War II, and that is the political, social, and cultural dimensions of change that started in 1942. You pick as a very interesting entry point to discuss this, and I wanted you to sort of give your little synopsis of some of the aspects that occur globally. For example, let's start with India. India is a great example because you have the aftermath of the defeat in Malaya, the Malayan campaign, where the British suffered one of their largest colonial defeat in in decades. I mean, probably, I think Churchill referred to it as one of the biggest defeats of English history, period. And then, of course, the aftermath of that, where large percentages of the POWs that are Indian decide to join the Indian National Army and then eventually participate in the invasion of India in 1944. But talk about the Quit India movement, because many Americans don't really associate that, don't think about Gandhi during the war, and just flush out your interpretation of that period of time.
If you read the newspapers from around the world, as I did, uh, for 1942, there are two big stories. One is Stalingrad, and the other is Gandhi. Gandhi is everywhere and crosses the lines. The Japanese celebrate him. The Germans are very, very interested in Gandhi, and Gandhi as a symbol represents a new way of thinking about the world in which colonial powers have lost their hegemony and have lost their grip, and that self-governance, self-rule, self-determination will will configure the new world. And the big symbol for that, Gandhi's is the symbol, but the event is Singapore. So the British defeat in Singapore in the middle of February 1942 is the end of British moral and political and military claims to empire. They will retake Singapore after the war for a decade, contest Malaysia for some time, but ultimately the Japanese defeat of the British and the Americans in the Philippines is the end of the colonial world and is opens up a period of not only national self-determination, but a contest for who speaks for the globe. Uh, there's half the world in 1942 is in China and India. That's not so different today. And in that sense, 1942 really opens up a new era. At the same time, Singapore is the event that spurs the internment of Japanese citizens, not just in the United States, but in Canada and throughout Latin America on the Pacific coast. So this is a global response to the Japanese victory, is internal racial military fronts in which citizens are rounded up. And this is all happening at once. So you have the breakout, you have the destruction of a colonial world, you have a vision of a post-colonial world based on various definitions contested of national self-determination, but you also have race wars that that move from Asia to North and South America. And that is one way to think about how war just proliferates, both domestically and in foreign in a foreign context in the year 1942. It's just a stunning proliferation.
Interesting, interesting. Now, let's turn to South Africa. South Africa is another situation that people don't think about. And of course, there were momentous changes that occur in South Africa during World War II that lay the basis for the victory of the Nationalist Party in 1948 that implements apartheid. But at the same time, there's also the growth and strength of the resistance to apartheid that ultimately will lead to the success of the ANC decades later. So, what's your take on South Africa?
Well, originally I was going to do Nigeria and Lagos, Nigeria, as one of these new boom towns of World War II, where people are streaming into the urban districts and completely changing the politics and the economics of day-to-day life because of the war. And Johannesburg works as well, but Johannesburg has so many more dramas. So you have it occurs right before World War II, but what happens in Johannesburg is it becomes a black majority, African majority city. And at the same time, most Africans in South America are urban dwellers. The fiction, it's already a fiction after World War One in the 1920s, that somehow the cities would remain white and the rural hinterlands would belong then to African indigenous peoples parceled out as and governed as tribes, is shown to be the fiction that it is. And suddenly, the so-called townships and restricted areas of Johannesburg really have to be thought of as suburbs of greater metro Johannesburg, in which there's a black majority population that is going to insist that and does insist on basic human rights, right to travel, right to open up a business, right to dance, right not to have a curfew, right to have political say, and the vote. And these are the issues that come up in Johannesburg and are not inconsistent with the Atlantic Charter that Churchill and Roosevelt have signed in August 1941. That's not Johannesburg isn't quite the vision that they have, but it's a derivative of the Atlantic Charter. And Mandela talks about the Atlantic Charter in his conception of the youth wing of the ANC in Johannesburg at that time. He's also a great swing dancer, dances to the same music as everybody else is around the world. The idea that you could manage in sort of some third way to steer between total uh, apartheid, which was the Dutch South African vision, and black majority rule proved untenable. And Smuts, the prime minister, uh, was just tied in knots. And ultimately, there's no liberal third way that somehow skirts the issue of one man, one vote. So South Africa is hugely interesting in that it previews many of the bloody and contested fights for national self-determination, and yet at the same time, apartheid wins. The even liberal whites will prefer apartheid to ANC rule, and and they build a white republic, which has its echoes in the United States. Because in the same year, 1942, you have huge debates about the poll tax in the United States Congress. It's passed, but it's not passed because of the filibuster in the Senate of the Southern senators. And so there's increasing hard stances made to protect white rule in the American South. That's why we call it the solid South. The solidity of the South is a defensive measure against this new wartime world of federal regulation, fair employment practices, internal migration. And it's one that doesn't last as long as apartheid, but it lasts until the early 1960s. And politics, white politics in the South is if you look at white primaries, white Democratic primaries, revolves around the issue of race and around maintaining Jim Crow, which no one conceived of something different. White Southerners did not conceive of anything different, and there were no compromises or mitigating issues on that whatsoever. And so you have in a way a mini apartheid state that's built up over the course of the 1940s, precisely because of the war in the American South. So South Africa and Mississippi and Alabama are echo each other in my narrative.
Yeah, very interesting, of course, to bring that up because, of course, we're looking at this debate of this case in Louisiana in front of the Supreme Court that essentially negates the Voting Rights Act, which, in terms of the impetus politically to create these reforms, was, of course, energized by World War II. So it's sort of ironic to sit and watch essentially the evisceration of the People's War impacts, if you will, of World War II domestically in the United States. And let's turn to your example of Richmond, California. Now, I've actually lived in Richmond, California.
Yeah,
So
I did too.
I lived in Richmond, California when it was on the downturn, let's put it that way. And of course, Kaiser aluminum steel. Kaiser is the big economic presence in Oakland during the war. And and at the same time, in the book, you talk about the racial tensions, the racial ambiguity, the conflicts that exist in the United States. And you talk about Richmond as an example, but of course, you were alluding just earlier to the South. But give us a sense of your take on what, how does Richmond exemplify, not exemplify the general trends happening in the United States in 1942 as the mobilization is underway?
Uh, 1/5 of the American population moves in World War II, and that contributes to the fivefold growth of places like Richmond, California. And now in World War II, for the first time, you have significant African American migration into California, into Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, and Richmond. That is accompanied by white Southern migration into those same places because this is just a pull function. These are magnets for workers who are earning 20, 25, $30 in 1942 equivalent an hour at Kaiser. And they desperately need people. I mean, then first they open up the crafts to women, then they open it up to African Americans and anybody uh, any free labor that they can get. And this creates tensions, racial tensions, redlining, slums, discrimination. Although right, although in 1942 the demand is for labor, and so many of all of the race barriers of industry fall. Promotions are a different matter, um, and so much of the racial tensions from the South become Americanized and exist in California as well, aggravated by the fact that it's white Southerners as well as black Southerners who are migrating. And then Detroit's another example.
Now
And
you
all of this is happening at once. You have this huge influx of people. You have new labor opportunities. You have new opportunities for women and African Americans. You have the fantastic growth of these places, and there are many different kinds of experiments, and some are hopeful, and some are familially tragic and sad.
hmm.
But the contest for the Atlantic Charter and the principles of the Atlantic Charter um, has started and will continue. The World War II is possessed by all the people involved as our war. It's reinterpreted, and rebels in Japanese occupied Asia will do the same. They take Japanese ideas about Asia for Asians and upend the idea of Japanese-led hierarchy.
Good point.
And so also is a European-only conception of the Allies overturned as well. It's not about Germany's invasion of Poland. It's about all sorts of invasions of foreign countries.
Yeah,
And
that's
that's what makes 1942 explosive and so dramatic.
Yeah, well, that's really one of the great strengths of the book because you tackle that. And you mentioned earlier, you sort of excluded Nigeria from the discussion. I remember years ago at the American Historical Association, I knew some friends of mine who organized a big 2-day, 3-day panel on Africa in World War II. And it was very funny to watch Gerhard Weinberg sit there and watch all this because Gerhard was sort of like acting like the police force, if you will, intellectually.
Yes, yes.
And
He's
he
still
was
with us.
Oh yeah. Gerhard's still with us and quite sprite and lively, and we had him on a couple of years ago during the pandemic. But that gets into the Atlantic Charter, and also you just raised the question of the impact of the Japanese on Asian nationalism. Uh, Talk more about, because we know the Atlantic Charter is taken seriously by those who are in favor of decolonization, and it is used and talked about during the war. It always amused me that people just tended to ignore that, or sometimes they say, "Oh, we rediscovered that," and I sort of found that always, as a serious historian of World War II, I find that quite entertaining and amusing to see that people have, ignored that for years. But anyway, um, talk a little bit more about that impact. And you mentioned that you did work on Nigeria. I'm sort of curious what you discovered in working on Nigeria, and also the Philippines is your example, because in the Philippines, of course, you have the defeat of the United States as a colonial power, and then you have the implementation of a regime that essentially aligns itself with Japan, even though there's resistance, armed resistance to Japanese power that evolves at the same time in 1942. But it's complicated when you look at, and of course, these kinds of processes lead directly into the post-war world. That's what's so important about World War II. It essentially lays the framework for decolonization, and as far as I'm concerned, the trends that we see manifested for the next 50, 60, 70, 80 years in our politics globally. But just talk a little bit about the Philippines and also Nigeria. What you excluded Nigeria? What would you have included if were talking about Nigeria?
Well, the cutting room, all
The
the
cutting
stuff
room.
that
Yeah,
has
there
to
you
be
go.
cut is, well, Lagos starts off as a city of about 35,000 in the 1930s, which is unimaginable if you think of the metropolis now of close to 10 million people. Um, it lacked a dramatic aspect, though. Although the British were slow in conceding some sort of timeline to self-rule, Lagos itself is a Nigerian city. There's a white quarter, but it's small. And the drama of Lagos in the war is a drama of crime, of losing tribal affiliations, of new opportunities, of young men and women making it, taking the train to Lagos, leaving behind tribe and countryside for city, the birth of a kind of individuality. And it's not black versus white. And so that is hugely interesting. You also have that in Johannesburg, but you have then more. What's fascinating about Nigeria is that there is a soccer club that travels all around Nigeria, north and south, Muslim and Christian, and crosses across the deltas because Nigeria is not so easy to get through. And they raise funds for the British war effort. That's what the soccer tour is all about. And they call themselves later the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. And so they raise money for the British war effort, but at the same time, they're talking about the future of Africa, the future of Nigeria, and democracy. And the head of the soccer club wants to prove that the Atlantic Charter is not Atlantic chatter. This isn't about Roosevelt and Churchill and colonial rulers. It is about a promise that is already formulated by all sorts of subordinated, oppressed people, and that is freedom and self-determination on the basis of individuals living in urban districts and cities and countries. And so the Atlantic Charter is easily echoes in the hopes and aspirations of all sorts of people. Now, there are collaborators, there are middle classes, there are intermediaries who have their own ideas, and there are plenty of colonial peoples who are willing to work with the colonial overlords, and that certainly happens in Nigeria, and it happens certainly in the Philippines, where large landowners are as worried about who rules in Manila as who has control over the country road in the outback. And so they are willing to accept Japanese occupation. The Japanese have also promised independence, just as the Americans have, and give independence to the Philippines in 1943. And so they are willing to collaborate. They also don't know that the Allies are going to win. You know, MacArthur says he's going to come back, but the only thing everybody in the Philippines knows is that he's left. And so there's nothing in 1942 that suggests that the Japanese are about to lose the war.
Mm.
Guadalcanal is a small island and is not the prelude to a frontal American attack until almost a year later. Uh, the next island, Tarawa, and is November 1943. So it's not at all clear that the Japanese are going to be rolled back anytime soon. And so what makes the Philippines so interesting is they live in Japanese time, and don't they have to? Shouldn't one learn Japanese as a young adolescent in school? But they remember American time too, and maybe the Americans are going to come back, and one is really divided, even in one's own head, between what time is it? 1942 does not tell you what time it is. 1944, 1945, that'll tell you the time. 1942 doesn't tell you the time.
Now, you also in the book deal with what goes on in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union with Ukraine and Poland, and of course, in 1942 is the acceleration of the machinery of the Holocaust. It goes on turbocharge,
It
uh,
does.
and then in the Ukraine, you have again the implementation. You know, the issue that people argue about that is in the planning process of Operation Barbarossa, that we're going to deliberately starve and kill 40 million plus people in order to create the Lebensraum in the occupation of the Soviet Union. And of course, that gets implemented in the Ukraine. So share with us what you discovered in terms of, and then of course you mentioned the literary works such as Vitaly Grossman's great contribution. But just share with us what you learned about Poland and the Ukraine.
I think there are two stories. One is just the audacious German planning and infrastructure building of a new racial empire in which there will be exterminated people, enslaved people, and privileged people. And the the administration of the occupied territories is based on this vision. And it goes quite a distance in 1942. The infrastructure of the Holocaust is built in the first months. So you have death camps connected to railway networks, connected to a set of connections that the Germans then have built with occupied France and their own allies and occupied Holland in order to deport thousands and thousands of people. The list is 11 million Jews from Ireland, Finland, Great Britain. Uh, and these lists are updated on a regular basis as more and more people are deported. And it's double column accounting. And this infrastructure is in place. The switch uh, is moved in March 1942, and trains begin to move. People are deported. The Great Wave is in July 1943. 42 from Amsterdam and from Paris, but the infrastructure continues. The turbocharge is absolutely right. The numbers of innocents destroyed and murdered between June and November 1942 constitutes the majority of those who will be murdered during the Holocaust. You have on the same railway networks the movement of Polish and Ukrainian labor to and fro from the places they live to the places that are designated to work, often in the Reich itself. And you have the railway transport of German settlers to their new homes. Those remain relatively experimental and short-lived, but there they are, both in Poland and Ukraine. So it's an absolutely audacious vision in which millions of civilians are sacrificed, not simply through murder and partisan warfare, which always nets more young boys than rifles, as they search the forests, but also in the starvation of the urban populations. That's the one story, if that's not enough. The other story is the fact that it's not just power coming down from the Germans. And Grossman's whole literary development is to realize that the evil is not the fascist. The evil is everywhere,
Hmm.
is fascistic behavior, but that's not necessarily German. He takes great pains, in fact, to distinguish the categories of German and Nazi as much as they overlap, but it's also Soviet, it's Russian, it's Ukrainian, it's every village that subdivides as the German authorities come in. Uh, it is not a hierarchy of victims that the Germans have arranged with the Jews at the bottom only. It's that Ukrainian neighbors will attack and feast upon the misfortune of their Jewish neighbors, plays itself out in tensions between Ukrainians and Poles, so that the desire for survival, a minimum of order and security, is completely undermined by the ongoing process of this social cannibalization in the neighborhoods that brings Grossman to tears.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
even in the ghetto, he's aware, and in the camps, he's aware, whether it's the labor camps in the Soviet Union or the concentration camps in Germany, he's well aware that there are hierarchies and pecking orders and exploitation there as well. And so, what he talks about, the good in mankind is very small, but that's all there is.
Yeah.
But it's extremely small by the time we get to his last big novel. And so it's not the heroic fascists being beaten by the Allies, which is a story that still, can move us, but it's worse. And it's the neighborhoods that divide against each other, and that have always done so. I mean, he goes to this in his fiction to this small courtyard, and it's not just that the power balance has changed now that the Germans come in and the communists have left. Old histories going back to the Revolution, to the Civil War, to collectivization, uh, are determining people's behavior, and it's very hard to see social coherence, social allegiance, and social loyalty. Uh, and Grossman himself, in the figure in his novel, even is tempted to kowtow towards Stalin, but he remembers his mother said, "Remain a man." And it's hard. and but remain a human being, and don't think that you have to sacrifice others to save yourself. If anything, it has to be the other way around, to sacrifice yourself for others if we are to have the glue of social uh, coherence and ultimate preservation. It's against survivalism and for community, but he's not optimistic.
Right. Well, and one thing that isn't optimistic in 1942 in the early months is whether the Allies are going to win. And in your book, I'm just sort of curious, you sort of, it's always a grand, huge, momentous task to take on the global military implications of what's happening at that time, the Battle of Atlantic not being won, the problematics of the fighting in the Soviet Union. The Germans still expect that they will win. Operation Blau, when it's initiated in 1942, is successful. The fear of the Allies that the Germans are going to seize the Suez Canal, and as the Germans move through the Caucasus, they're going to take the Middle East. We haven't even talked about the Middle East. And then from there, join with the Japanese and take India. So there's all these fears that are legitimate. And then you have the turning points, the unexpected success of the Navy at Midway, um, Guadalcanal, which is, I think Americans, again, an extraordinary event, one that bogs down the Japanese in a war of attrition in the Pacific. But at the same time, we have the war in China going on, which is also interesting because recently I attended an event where they were essentially minimizing the war in the Pacific that the Allies mount and essentially talking about how the Chinese, the Kuomintang, of course, was not opposed to Chinese communists, which is sort of amusing, and blending them all together as one great source of we aligned with the Soviet Union and winning World War II. That's what sort of happened in Beijing, which I consider interesting as a interpretation of history, but not accurate. And of course, leading to the Battle of Stalingrad. So what, in looking at that, the land, air, and sea aspects of 1942, which is contingency and steroids. So how do you sort of look on all that?
Yeah, a contingency in steroids. Um, the Japanese and the Japanese were in a real quandary because they had this huge empire that they had to protect without resources really to do so. But if the Japanese and the Germans were going to win, they had to strike fast. And in 1942, a victory in the Middle East certainly would have done that, and it would have really set the Allies behind, could have divided them. It would have been a major coup. It would have required Japanese-German calibration. But many of these battles are also very close. First of all, Midway's a total fluke. This is a battle that the Americans lost. Um, almost every single bomber that they sent from the island and from the aircraft carriers was destroyed. Uh, and it was only literally in the last 10 minutes that the dive bombers come from on high with Japanese fighters deployed below on aircraft carriers that are in the very worst minute of vulnerability. And the Americans have this a tremendous victory and destroy the four aircraft carriers. Guadalcanal, not clear whether it couldn't have gone to the Japanese in October 1942, especially when you consider the huge naval losses of the Americans at that time. And really, Henderson Field was just hanging on, as the New York Times reporter confirmed. And the New York Times basically writes an epitaph to Guadalcanal. The, the defenders in Stalingrad are divided geographically. The Germans have split. So there's a little toehold in the center of town, a little toehold in the north. But the Germans have 95% of Stalingrad. This is also not 100. And of course, the drama of Stalingrad is not about the city. because the Soviets have this massive plan, Operation Uranus, that completely, totally outflanks every frame and prediction, and pushes the Germans to the east of all places, hard up against the Volga River. But the Battle of the city, Stalingrad itself, is also a very close thing. And one might ask what would have happened on the 1st of November had the 1942 had the Germans actually pushed off the last remaining Red Army holdouts from the western side of the Volga River. Big picture, though, the steroids, the Americans and indeed the Soviets had the capacity, the deep capacity of men, industry, factories, technical know-how that is very, very difficult, even in 1941, to imagine the Japanese and Germans ultimately winning the war. That's the big picture, but it sure didn't look like that in 1942, and and a well-timed series of provisional Axis victories might have had political and moral effects that we can no longer imagine. But in terms of sheer industrial capacity, Japan had no chance against the United States.
Yeah, and anyone who wants to start asking questions, please raise your hands. The reason I raised contingency is many years ago, um, I interviewed
The North Vietnamese didn't have a chance against the United
right,
States either,
exactly.
right?
Well, exactly. See, that's the whole thing. You all go right back to this issue of Materialschlacht, if you will. Um, and I remember interviewing several of the aviators who fought at Midway.
Oh,
Uh,
did you?
yes, and unfortunately, some of the best stuff got destroyed in the flood. But I had long conversations with Richard Best, who is the individual attributed to having sunk the Akagi. And it was just happenstance. He describes it as, we just happened to be at the right place at the right time and the wrong time for the Japanese when he wound up
Right.
with Dauntlesses, breaking through the clouds, and there he saw the carrier down there. They were
Yeah.
trailing a destroyer, and that was trying to join the main force, and that's how they got to the aircraft carriers. Completely problematic, and he first one to admit it was luck. So anyway, do people have comments or questions for Peter? Anybody have any comments? Just raise your hands and I'll get to you. Um, Alex, do you have a comment or question? Yeah, go on, Michael. Just unmute Mike.
Well, actually, again, the Battle of Midway, to use a general term, like it was just a fluke. No, it wasn't. There was intelligence gathering before the battle. You can attribute luck to a certain degree in any battle, but it did also have to do with good planning and skill on the part of the United States, and perhaps a certain degree of hubris on the part of the Japanese. Which brings the point that, I mean, I would say that the last year of the war was probably much more influential, which with the on international basis, with the revelation of the camps, the concentration camps, and the death camps, and the Holocaust, and the revelation of what the Japanese had done, not just with POWs, but in China, etc. That really, it was shall we say, the realization of what hubris could do to this idea that, okay, we're right, we're always right, or there's nothing wrong with us. We basically, the world order was changed basically by people saying that, well, wait a second, look at the depths that any human being can sink to. Look at what
Yes.
is wrong with us. And that, as far as the change in the world order, Britain was already changing to a large degree. You could say it started with the Fabians, but it was already changing into less of a feeling of a colonial order into a empire of ideas, so to speak, which is basically what is left of the British Empire. But and I think that I don't think you can pin it in 1942, because in 1942 there were what had happened was it looked like the Axis could still win, but in both the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific and Asia, it's the tide had turned. The tide began to turn. The Axis
But
powers.
tides only turn in retrospect, right? You don't know it then.
Well, you may not know it then, but there was a feeling. I mean, I had spoken to people, including my own parents, who, when they heard about the Battle of Midway, they felt the tide had turned. They were, I mean, my father was already in the Eighth Air Force, but the people there knew something had changed. We were moving onto the offensive, and the Axis was moving onto the defensive. It doesn't mean the war was over, and it doesn't mean that the war was won, but it did begin to look like the war could be won. And
sure.
So the fact is, it wasn't this just feeling of it's over, or we don't have much of a chance. It was more of a feeling that hope. There was solidity to the hope that the Axis could be defeated. And again, it had to do with the fact of changing. I mean, the American precision bombing campaign had already started again. So you also had round the clock bombing. The Axis were now being put onto the back foot, so to speak. That there was a general feeling of that. Also, I would say that, and by the way, I'm not putting this into question, but it is, because I want your opinion on it. The last year of the war was probably more influential, let's say, with India, because it was Indian troops and, shall we say, colonial troops, as the British would have called it before the war, colonial troops that actually were the mainstay of the victory against the Japanese. So I don't know. I mean, Singapore was a big event as far as a military defeat, but I would say that the mechanism, the feeling of liberation, the idea that, I mean, India wasn't freed through military force. It was more of it was more psychological, and that probably happened more with the Allied offensive. So that the last year of the war was probably more influential in all of these movements. Anyway, I'm not sure if I'm making myself quite clear, but I'm positing that.
Well, I mean, World War II can only be understood as a globe, and as a globe, you don't have a fixed perspective, and you're always going to look at it differently and argue about it, and there are different ways to think about it. I'm very invested in an anti-fascist view, and given who my grandparents were and so on, but socialists in Weimar, Germany. But the the idea that the British Empire was already a commonwealth with the spirit of cooperation and global collaboration was the progressive view in the colonial office that was hardly shared by Churchill or by the millions and millions of people who were without any rights in the British Empire. And they would have disputed the idea that this was already a pre-Commonwealth, and fought hard in many cases in order to achieve uh, power in order to dictate terms. But you're right, things like Quit India were defeated by the British. What's so extraordinary, though, about Quit India is that it's literally that's what it meant. It meant that we want the British out now, and we're going to kick them out now, and this is going to happen in 4 weeks. This is not part of a longer term Indian independence struggle. This was do or die at the moment, and it's part of the mythology of India, and it's been integrated with the service not only of the Indian Army, the largest volunteer army in the world in 1942, allied with the British, but also with the Indian National Army. And each of those strains, the international airport in Calcutta is named for Bose. Each of these strains is part of Indian national identity today. The I do think that the Allies were going to win, and Midway is indeed the first time that we snatched something from them instead of them snatching something from us. But despite the intelligence that we had, and of course our aircraft carriers were there and not in Honolulu, this could easily have been a major American defeat.
Right.
And the camps and all of that, that was known in 1942. We had very good knowledge of the death camps, and that knowledge was clear. And but whether it happened in 42 or 45 or 44 doesn't really matter. What we learned was what man does to man, what humans do to humans. It's not that they die, it's that they live on in these noxious forms. And that's why when I teach the Holocaust, the Auschwitz is a slap in our faces, all of our faces, because we now know what humans do become and can become. And you don't just have to take the German perpetrators to follow that wisdom up. And it's not death, it's life. That's the scary thing that comes out of World War II. It's the noxious forms of life. And that's why I'm not saying, nuclear holocaust can't happen. I get that. I'm just saying if you concentrate only on that coming out of 1945 and Hiroshima and World War III, you miss the fact that it is about these noxious forms of life that proliferate in 1942 that can't easily be arranged into Axis and Ally, that go beyond Greek tragic visions of hubris. Because German racism is not hubris, it's more than that. And that's what 1942 puts into focus. But it's not the key that opens every door. And that's certainly true.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there. It was Richard Best who actually was as you know, Michael, was the guy who sunk the Akagi, and it was
Yes.
his comments about the contingency, the luck, we came upon them. We all know the strategic background about what happened that led to that. But it was not inevitable. And I would also note that Tobruk falls in 1942, I believe, after Midway. And
After Midway.
that, of course, freaks Churchill out completely. It spurs FDR to send an emergency infusion of armor that I believe goes through the Mediterranean to reach the Eighth Army. And again, it just shows you the problematics of how they perceived the situation at the time. Now, I would not. You mentioned the end of the war with the involvement of the different colonial troops that were fighting for the British in the campaign in Burma. And that, of course, includes, mainly Indian troops, but also the divisions of Africans who fight. But
Right.
then what happens with that? That all spills over into post-colonial period, all throughout Africa, all throughout India. And the INA, remember, they have the trial of the INA, four officers that become a cause célèbre in Indian nationalist politics. They are viewed as resisting colonialism, not collaborating with the Japanese. So again, and then this question of how people psychologically reacted to Midway in the United States. I don't doubt that. My father was getting ready to go to the military academy at that period of time. So, but again, the issue of we are now in a long war and we don't know what is going to happen at the end of it. We're in for a tough struggle. That was the emphasis of the propaganda domestically in the United States at the time. Um, and all the opinion polls showed that. So it was uncertain. It was no certitude that we were going to win. And all of us are familiar with the literature about the inner sanctum of the highest levels of Allied strategic policymaking at the time. They are not clear. They're also uncertain too. And this is way before Casablanca, way before, you look at all the discussions they have in planning after Pearl Harbor. All they're not sure. They're not sure. There's no certainty in anything. But anyway, go on, Alex.
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So this period is kind of like a very transform 42 is a very transformational year for the United States. It's the end of the Great Depression, of course, which you know does not end until we get full mobilization and production during the war. Um, and you, you were mentioning, of course, again, the problems of the South. But on the other hand, Roosevelt takes steps, and I know because I have friends who write on this, to integrate African Americans into industry, and specifically, allowing to many of the industrial jobs for the new war economy. Also, you know, Americans are going to land. I don't know if you cover it in your book. In North Africa, and they're kind of for the first time. Of course, they'll go into Europe. Italy and France, and millions of Americans will kind of, physically wind up kind of seeing the world for the first time. And of course, that has an effect on our later international involvement after the war. So I wonder, yeah, what you think again about these, just and of course, the U.S. is going to emerge as the half of the industrial production in the world in 45. So
One
yeah,
half, that's right.
talk about just basically the transformation of the U.S. into well, people will argue a global hegemon by the end of the war. Thanks.
Um, yeah, that's an interesting question, Alex. The whole issue of that. Uh, Talk about how the racial problem in the United States becomes nationalized in the war, Peter.
Well, I mean, in many ways, the South literally moves to the North. Um, and so that the first great migration brought African Americans into cities, but the masses of the numbers really occur in World War II. And so you have black districts in Chicago, but they expand greatly in the 1940s and the 1950s, ditto for Detroit. You have tremendous racism. You also have attempts to create a kind of American governance in these areas where people will work and have to work together. And it is a big struggle. Detroit empties out. So you have white suburbs and a city that can't expand and create expansion for its tax base, and that is the problem in St. Louis as well. And so you have structural problems, but you also have the ideas of the Atlantic Charter, the ideas of Americanism, the ideas of independence and liberty and equality, that Southerners, in fact, you can register the force of these ideas by looking at how defensive Southerners are in the 1940s and how very much on the defensive they feel against the liberal temper of the times. Read the Atlantic Charter, and the resolution of, it's somewhat half-hearted, but the resolution of the federal government to provide efficient ways of full employment, which means ending the color bar. And you have both of those stories, and they continue to this day. But there's lots of great, wonderful, and inspiring things that are part of American history that becomes cosmopolitan as well as imperial, that looks beyond neighborhood and thinks about the idea of the nation. And that is tremendous moral strength that the Axis powers do not have.
Interesting.
If you were to measure it in terms of moral capital, however qualified, compromised, problematic it is in the Allied quarter, there's nothing similar in Germany or Japan. Nothing.
Hmm. Now, it's interesting, I wanted to throw a little monkey wrench into this, and that is you're you mentioned the movie Lifeboat by
The
Hitchcock.
what?
The movie Lifeboat.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But I wanted to, one of the things that's interesting about the war is that this is the period of time, really Hollywood's greatest power culturally in reaching and influencing public opinion is World War II. There's this growth of movie theaters during the war because of the nature of, 24-hour movie theaters come into the war because of the nature of the workforce working 24 hours a day. And you have cultural expression. And, we have all these interpretations. Everybody's, watching the Turner Movie Channel these days. But as you know, if you grew up in a urban city like New York or somewhere else, we were exposed to these kind of movies all our adult lives. Um, and there's a tenor and milieu and sort of mythos of America that's being portrayed. A popular frontism creeps into some of this is the height of the power of the Communist Party in Hollywood, et cetera. But also, this is popular frontism sort of merges into the meaning of FDR being president beyond these kind of categories, and that cultural expression is well underway. And then, of course, in Europe, you're having movies like Jude Seuss come out, which are very different politically in their motivation. But I'm wondering what your feeling is about these issues of mass culture in 1942. Is there a distinctive trend that sort of intersects with your look at this? Is it globally break out in the same sense that you're talking about in the book, politically, economically, and socially, as you discuss in all these trends unleashing themselves in 1942? Is there a cultural relationship to that occurs simultaneously?
In a way, I mean, I say in the book at one point that in World War II, there are no foreign wars. Everybody sees the war as their own and defines it in their own terms. And at the same time, you have this tremendous traffic of a playlist, a common playlist. And it begins with swing music, but it's also the movies, it's also the slogans of the Atlantic Charter. They're interpreted in different ways, but this is a real phenomenon. And it seeps over actually into the Axis camp, and that creates a common enough vocabulary for people to understand the stakes of the war. And if you follow a sort of popular front interpretation, you would be fighting this double V war, victory at home in addition to the victory abroad, using using the scandal of Germany's invasion of Poland to rethink anybody's invasion of someplace else, both at home and abroad. And that's what happened in World War II. It's this tremendous proliferation. At the same time, it's contested. It's contested in Johannesburg. It's contested in Jackson, Mississippi, and Richmond. And so there are a lot of stories. Swing music is everywhere, and yet it's World War II when country music gets to hold on to the jukeboxes and becomes a standard American fare. And I think that's useful to remember that it's in 1942 that you can be tuning the radio and you'd hear country music just as much as you'd hear swing. And that is a part of the new mix of America as well as American mass culture.
Right, and there's no doubt about that. That then, of course, is where we see that after the war, when rock and roll becomes swing, basically moves and becomes rock and roll, or R&B becomes internationalized. It's an amazing phenomenon. Ted's here, Ted Cook, and Ted, I'm sort of curious about your take on 1942 from the point of view of Japan. What do you see are the changes that happen in Japan that sort of that you think are important to emphasize? Because we've been talking about the issue of the co-prosperity sphere, the sort of internationalization of the impact of the Japanese victory against the Russians in 1905, how that impacted on Asian nationalism, and how it's manifested in the kind of nationalist movements that occur as a result of the victory of the Japanese in the early part of 1942. The INA, we didn't talk about Indonesia. We talked a little bit about the Philippines, but we see that going on all over China. But what's your take about Japan in relationship to this whole question of 1942?
I apologize for not being able to join you so early enough to hear the talk. I'm fascinated with the topic, of course, and as you know, for me, the 1942 was, of course, a critical moment for the Japanese because it's the second war they launched, their new war, and one which they entered knowing, or the Japanese leadership entered knowing how problematic the whole conflict was, but how unavoidable in their view it was. No, so I'm just struck with the comments we were talking about film. For 1942, of course, it was one of the Japanese had a magnificent film and cultural burst of energy at the in 1936, 37, I mean 1937, 38, 39, where they recorded their experiences in the China War. And of course, the China War was for Japan, the war that broke out, the China Incident, the China War, that the Sacred War, as they were calling it at that time, with China, had led to early victories, and of course, the conquest of the Chinese capital. The presumed soon to surrender Chinese. It didn't happen, but the writing up of the cultural experience of being at war was a major cultural event in Japan in those years. But that was 4 years before. And so by 1941, the opportunity to create a unifying Japanese national image and existing a theory of what it was, what this Greater Asia War was all about, was an amazing opportunity for the Japanese government to do it, and also for the creative people involved in Japan. And so there were, and most of us don't see them, but there were very powerful novels written, and books written, and poetry written to commemorate this new war. And the theme of the project that, of course, I'm working on, the Sacred War, Japan's Experience 37 to 45 book that I'm trying to desperately complete. That's why I'm not so active these days with you guys, because I'm trying to do that along with my medical stuff. I'm trying to find myself a way to tell the war from the Japanese perspective at the time, what the Japanese at the time, 1942, 43, 44, saw. And that what they didn't see were the battles that they lost. The war was masked. The tremendous triumph at Pearl Harbor, the book, the film and movie that Hawaii Melee, Amelia Hawaii Okikaisen, the film, was a huge success in the early 1942, and everyone got to see that's where they used uh, the training materials that they had used for the attack on Pearl Harbor. They used that in the film, and so you were able to look at the planes flying in and bombing Pearl Harbor using the films that they had taken at that time, cut into that movie. Stories of young Japanese who had fought the brilliant campaigns in the Southeast Asia and the attack in Hawaii, all were part of that cultural boom in the early 1942. Now, that's only one little aspect of it. You talked about so much of this. For the Japanese to rearm the Japanese people, to refocus the Japanese people on a war against the world was no small task. No small task. The Japanese people were already mobilized, fully immobilized. There was not anything to squeeze out of the Japanese economy in 1942 that hadn't been squeezed out before. And of course, that's one of the main themes of what I'm writing about, is showing how the Japanese people moved one step at a time into this new war. And of course, they miss Guadalcanal, for example. They don't see the story the way we see it. They were going to go on in the end of 1942, and they don't know about Midway, the Japanese public. And so the Japanese government, facing the realities of the strategic setback in 1942 summer, and then the following disaster up in Atsu later on, all a part of a Japanese government's efforts to keep the Japanese people from knowing about the war. And so I would argue, and I will argue, and I do argue in the book. Well, I don't argue in the book. I let the Japanese people argue the case for me. In late 42 and early 43, we see the Japanese government and the Japanese people facing events that we know in the United States so openly, so culturally apparent. The Japanese government has tried to suppress the idea. So this is what I find fascinating, because I love comparing British World War II songs and American World War II songs, and how they overlap. I mean, the wonderful literature and singing and glorious popular culture that breaks out in England, even during the Blitz and then after the Blitz, and in the United States. You talk about swing music and everything else. Well, Japanese, of course, are suppressing all of that. They're purging everything except German music out of the Japanese Western model. And the German music in World War II is not so great, right? You got the classics, but what do you have? You've got you're not importing pop songs from Hitler's Germany into the Japanese mind, though Japanese German culture was extremely popular in pre-war Japan. Japanese movies and German movies and things like that were very much a part of what they wanted. But as I pointed out in Japan at War, and we did the interviews with a number of the Japanese Japanese directors and actors who had experienced the war. Watching the American movies was the great highlight up until 1941, December 7th. I mean, 2 or 3 days before that, they were waiting and praying for the new English movies to be released into Japan. So the breaking of the cultural tread to the West was not completed until this 1941 December the 8th. Now, to turn December 8th into the beginning of the new world was what the Japanese government had to do, and it had to revitalize an entire nation for a war which obviously, to any Japanese who was well educated, was obviously a huge task. But because it went so well, as the way they saw it, and the way it was reported so well, and the way in which the Western powers seemed to disappear, fade away, things that I don't believe anyone in the Japanese high command had the faintest idea would actually succeed. The exception might have been Yamashita Tomoyuki. General Yamashita actually sent troops back from his campaign in Singapore. He knew that he didn't need as many troops, or felt he didn't need as many troops as he had been given for that initial campaign, which is an amazing decision. His assessment of the British ability to defend Singapore was much more on square than certainly anyone in Britain thought. The British, the failure to be able to defend Malaya, and of course the extraordinarily quick seizure of the Dutch East Indies, was a miracle, militarily speaking. Combined arms operations not to be seen again in the war until much later in the war in the West, Western powers. and Western Europe. And it's an amazing thing if we look at it in its pieces. And so you sort of wonder, and I think many of us do who study the Japan, and I know Alex and Jim both talked to me about this, and Mike too, how difficult it must have been to imagine how the Japanese get so bad later in the war when they were so good at the beginning of the war. And I wish I could answer that question clearly. Training, preparation, certainly, but also the quality of the enemy. So the American failure in 1942 it's got to be put on the top of the list. Colonial disaster. The inability of the American military in 1942, before Midway, we're talking about, to understand what they were facing was clearly a part of the Japanese success. And the defense of the Philippines is a catastrophe. I would have to
Yeah,
argue.
it's amazing his reputation survived.
Exactly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Every mistake that could have been made was made. And the Japanese are flying over. If you look at the Japanese official military history records of what the Japanese was surveying, they were flying over the Philippines all through the fall of 1941. They had their place mapped, you know. They knew what was going on. And they were Japanese observation planes over that, flying from Taiwan. And why weren't the Americans more concerned with that? It's a real interesting issue. And why would the high command make the same mistake, you know, anyway, but the draining of resources from the defense of the Philippines, the inability to train up a Philippine army. Of course, the catastrophe, it all comes down to this disaster of Bataan and the Corregidor, and we see that the story is told at Bataan and Corregidor that becomes the primary narrative of the West for 1942 vis-a-vis the Philippines. So Americans are going to see the war through the movie Bataan, where in the original Bataan movie, it's the Australian, I guess, who commits suicide, dives his plane into the bridge. I think he's an Australian, at least an Englishman, perhaps English accent. It's the Americans who fight to the death in their little pit as the Japanese come charging out of the jungle. I mean, the American popular cultural image of fighting to the death, of fighting and never surrender, that's an American image in 1942, right? In the movie like Bataan, the original Bataan.
Right.
And we're facing that situation. We're facing the end of the world. For the Japanese, that moment, the popular culture image is success and unexpected success, I would argue.
You know, it's so interesting. It's a huge success, and this is the greatest moment in modern Japanese history.
Yeah.
And you can even ask why their colonial policy was so rigid, because just a few shifts here and there would have given them huge benefits, whereas for the Germans, it was completely impossible for them to move outside their racial ideas.
Yeah.
But the reason the Japanese did so well, the reason they entered the war was the same reason they lost the war, which is resources.
Well, no, I think
and by 1942, American submarines were sinking merchant shipping, so that they never were able to gain the benefit of their huge empire.
Well, no, they were never ever capable of. And I would argue now that I found some documentary sources where in 1942, they were in 41, they were fully capable, fully understood the inability to bring the resources back from the South. They knew that.
I would love to ask
the alternative is to surrender. That's what I keep putting in my mind.
Exactly.
What do I do if I'm the Japanese government in 1942? Fall 42, fall 41 rather, and the war is coming, and you can forecast the war, as I have a whole chapter on the Japanese Total War Research Institute where they actually do that, and they forecast the war, and they see they can't possibly win.
Well, they insist on China, right? They won't give it up.
Yeah, and yet.
But
China,
I'd like to ask you.
I agree with that. Yes. Yeah.
You say that the Japanese didn't know about Guadalcanal, but what's interesting. I don't.
Well, I should take that.
Read Japanese.
Let me take that back. They didn't know about Guadalcanal as it was. Okay, that's why. Yeah.
But what I find interesting is the songs of the Japanese and the cult of death. Actually concede the enormous pain and perhaps the death of the whole idea. The willingness of so many Japanese men not to let themselves be taken prisoner, and this mass cultural celebration of this willingness, and yet the admission that there'll be corpses everywhere.
Yeah.
And that the tears of victory are also the tears of sadness, the tears of loss, is an extraordinary thing. I mean, in a way, I'm just thinking of the songs. The tears of victory are the tears of loss. It's a very melancholy twist to this exuberance of victory in 1942. But the capital of Pearl Harbor, boy, that continues to pay benefits, just like the German defeat of France. And that's why the Germans kept on going. I mean, June 1940 just is a gift that keeps on giving for the German Wehrmacht, like Pearl Harbor for the Japanese.
I of course am very, very interested in the Japanese representation of the war, all the paintings during the war, and the artists and the writers and the singers, as you said, the songs, the creation of the notion that the Japanese people wanted to die. We have to remember the Japanese population from the 19th century is not a samurai society. This whole samurai mythology had to be manufactured out of nowhere in the
I back into this thesis.
War.
But there are hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war in 1942, 43 even, through Tawara, whereas the Japanese have tens of thousands of Allied prisoners. I mean, we don't have Japanese prisoners.
No. But well, it's a long argument to be made on that. So, and I have 2 chapters on Atsu, on what Atsu, why Atsu.
Yeah. And you know that surgeon, right? Who has the diary? I mean, it's totally fascinating.
Yeah. So
I can't wait to read the book. Read mine on the songs and see if you are somewhat persuaded.
I have all the albums. All the
he does.
I used to have everything on DVD. I had the Japanese films were made onto those magnificent laser discs we used to have, and unfortunately, I loaned my laser disc to ABC television to make a documentary, and we were part of, and then they took them. I didn't get them back. But stop frame. So you have these magnificent films from the 1939, 40 films, which you could use, and then look. Also, I had them for the Meieoki Kaisen bottle, which of course, like the Japan at War thing that they like at the Japan Society not many years ago. We bought some of those films too.
Right. Well,
and now we have them. Anyway, I don't want to take any more time. Thank you for stepping in on your talk.
No, it's fine, Ted. And also what's interesting about what Peter's raised a lot of interesting questions in my mind, because 1942 has sort of a handle to put a lot of interesting looks at. I'm thinking about Latin America. I'm thinking about the Middle East. I'm thinking about China in 1942. I mean, because again, I'm reacting to this conference I went to 2 weeks ago, where they essentially argued that the Guomindang Order of Battle was united with the PLA Order of Battle throughout the war, and they all had one great harmonious battle against the Japanese, which is complete bullshit. I found that to be really an interesting thing. But Peter's book, 1942, is what we're talking about.
Yes.
It's a really good, and those of you who watch this, it's a really good synthesis of a lot of the political, cultural, and social history in all the different parts of the world. And it handles the military. The military stuff we know is a tough issue to fight, to sort of do that. But Peter does a good job synthesizing a lot of literature. Again, we talk about the Battle of Stalingrad. I'm somebody, as you know, Ted, we brought David Glantz in here to New York several times, Peter, over the past 25 years to talk about the Battle of Stalingrad, those massive volumes he does. And what always struck me, as you mentioned November 1st, was how a near-run thing that whole battle was. for both the Germans and and the Soviets. But Michael, why don't you have the last word here? Michael, go on.
Right. Well, first of all, I just want to say as 2 points here, but as far as films go, um, in 1942, particularly, the purpose of the film industry was simply as a tool of propaganda and a tool
Oh,
of morality.
absolutely.
The real contributions that film made to our understanding of the war really started after the war, when guys started coming back from the war. So you would have films like 12 O'Clock High and A Walk in the Sun, and in Britain, The Cruel Sea, and of course, The Best Years of Our Lives.
Right.
Which leads me to because the real, it seemed to be, I mean, whenever I see the film, the main character, the one character in The Best Years of Our Lives that we're seeing the war, the post-war world through, is the Dana Andrews character. People celebrate the Harold Russell character as something, but the one that seemed to be particularly representative of the mainstream, the veterans who were in the mainstream, would be that character, um, and it led me. I mean, when I was talking before about hubris, and I would love to be able to say that racism, we changed our views on racism, but that was slow to change.
Oh,
Obviously,
well, hell, we're going backwards. Come on,
we're
man. We're
going
going
backwards
backwards.
right now. Yeah. So, I mean, I'd love to be able to say it had a major effect, but anyway, but the fact is that I can only say that from the perspective, let's say, of my father, who was this tough street kid from New York, and but what he learned is that no matter how tough you are or how nerdy you are, it didn't matter. An anti-aircraft shell blew you up all the same. So he'd better start using his brains. There was, when I'm talking about that hubris, I'm talking about in the minds of the individuals that fought the war, that went through it. There was a change of thinking, a change of thought. And as far as what the war revealed, the, the, the lower recesses that humanity could sink to, kind of, even in people who didn't think in terms of, who didn't intellectualize it quite as much, there was kind of a feeling of, you know, we've got to see things the way they are. We've got to see things, the truth with a capital T, who we are, where we are, what's going on. That type of thing is what I thought really happened, really was affected when the bulk of allied, U.S., Canadian troops, British troops, all types of allied troops really came back. Because when you're going through something, you don't have the freedom to assess it. But once it's over or once it's ending, you have more, your mind can grapple with those things. And that goes for the people back home as well. So I was wondering I mean, I know we try to say 1942 was a pivotal year, 43, 44, 45. But if it isn't this kind of, as far as how it changed the world afterwards, it really was after we could assess what had gone on. I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
It's a beautiful statement. And I wonder if your answer isn't based on a very American question, because I'm just thinking, the Germans certainly, the year 1942, all 1942 produced from the individual soldier's perspective was death, amputated limbs, disappointed vacation plans because they weren't going to come home by Christmas. And sure, if you read the diaries, you find this hard-boiled, let's look at the facts view. But in the end, survival for them was to tie themselves ever tighter to victory, because that was the only way they were going to get out of the Eastern Front, was victory. And it was the rare person, very rare, My father, he deserted. He just said he forget, but he deserted late when he could. He was young anyways, 18 in 1945. But I think I think it's very, very uh, evocative what you say about the American military experience, which would have been a 1943-44 experience tracked by the journalists at the time. And um, if they're not counterparts to the mass military experience on the German and Japanese side, why not? And that's what I try to pose in my question about the armies, is that you do have the traumatic experience of the human male body on the battlefield, but you also have the role of ideology, which cannot, which is the stunning lesson of the 20th century, of the first half of the 20th century, cannot be diminished. And the German troops are just different in fundamental ways, despite their own terrible, terrible, terrible experiences. So I think you raise a really interesting question, but you're right on about the Americans. And it would seem to be true that the closer you get to any battle, the more it looks like a defeat.
Well, one thing that is clear from when we had our discussion with you last time on the first 100 days of Hitler, it was very interesting because some of the people who participated were indeed very prolific authors on World War II history. And they were very offended by discussing, they didn't know anything about what had happened really with the rise of Hitler. It's sort of interesting to me because they said, why talk about it? Because they had to support Trump. So they were like very angry that I was making these analogies, which I think I would continue to make. Although, of course, we're not like Weimar Germany. We're our own unique kind of situation. Which brings me to, Michael knows I spent about a year and a half interviewing soldiers who liberated concentration camps a long time ago during the 50th anniversary of World War II. And the one comment that always sticks in my mind was the company commander who led the first troops into Dachau. And his comment was, Jim, when I'm dead, they can say Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck liberated Dachau because I won't be here anymore. And it raises the question of, we don't have anybody. We don't have 9 million or 10 million or 11 million World War II veterans alive at this point in the United States. It's a very small amount. And I'm wondering, when you deal with, and I'm sort of like watching how the Academy has dealt with the memory issue for the past several decades, which can drive me nuts, but I've learned a lot from that kind of, from Maurice Halbwachs and Pierre Nora. I've learned a lot from that. But where are we at now, in your mind? With, like, you come out with a book on World War II. I used to hear publishers tell me they don't sell anymore. And they're nervous about handling the war. And I'm wondering where you think we're at as a society about what lessons we're drawing. What lessons, when we read a book like yours, which deals with the global impact in terms of colonization, in terms of nationalism, of terms of trying to understand what happens after World War II. And then, of course, we're confronted with people deciding to market their particular version of what they understand World War II is all about all the time. And we're in the middle of a 250th anniversary of the revolution, etc. So where are we at in terms of all this with World War II in your minds, in terms of our popular consciousness and the Academy's consciousness?
Well, I wrote the book in order to rehabilitate a nightmare, which was a war without end, that you were constantly handed from one war to another war, that I found in 2019 to be salient. Today, I would mourn the loss of every World War II soldier who had some sensibility of what a larger national project was that could not be fitted into easy, pre-cut ideas of heroism or Americanism, all of which underwent tremendous change. And I think we're divided between the good war a recent book on World War II called that a fairy tale. It's not a fairy tale. It had real purchase on people, this good moral war. But the idea that that is the only story of that war, certainly from the perspective of all the outcasts, all the people who are not in the narrative, all the dead,
Yeah. Nice.
suggests that we have to think
Absolutely.
in other terms about international conflict. But I will not let go of the moral value of that war. And if the books aren't selling now, it's because that we're unwilling to make commitments to our friends and to our history and to our better natures and to our soul. And I would find that very sad. It's a government without soul and without memory.
Yeah, go on, Ted. You're going to say
Well,
something?
I just, if I get a moment, I want to thank you so much for that commentary. I mean, after all, Andre Schiffrin got me to do Japan at War by asking, could you do a book on Japan like Studs did on
The Good
the
War.
Good War?
Yeah.
I was sitting there in the office in his penthouse, and I was thinking to myself, oh my God, what a task I would be taking on to try to do something like that. And of course, but fortunately, my partner, Mary, I was sitting there with Haruko Taya Cook, and Haruko said yes. So we answered, and we got ourselves on that track to do Japan at War. But I think every nation, every people who fought in that war have individual stories. And one of the most powerful images in Japan at War for us, in the back is the sister of a young Toko, Kaiten pilot who died at the very end of the war, and she said, my brother was my mother's only son. He counted 6 million dead, millions of dead in the Tokyo fire wave, but he was my mother's only son. I can't quote it exactly. My mother's only son, my only elder brother. Count the dead one by one, and that's so the dead have to be part of the story of the war. My father lost his elder brother in the Pacific War. My mother was a volunteer the day after Pearl Harbor to be a nurse. Ended up in Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, as a flight nurse, flying in and taking out what was left of the Marine that might survive. And so those kind of commitments of individuals to that war, I completely agree with you. But it's on both sides.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
tremendous depth. That's
anyway,
right. Yeah.
anyway, I want to thank Peter. Peter Frisch is the author of
Thank you.
1942,
Thank you very much, Peter.
and it's a great read, a great look at the year 1942, and it's always a great pleasure, Peter, to talk with you about these subjects. What are you working on next?
Fascism, a love story.
Ah! Oh wow! What's that? That's a general. Is that based on a person or?
It's a story that launches from a movie in Berlin, 1930, about a Sunday spent in the countryside. Four young people go out, and it's a very sweet movie about Berlin and about love and about disappointment and about Monday coming after Sunday, but also Sunday returning at the end of the week. And uh, and what happens? But Sunday is not just a day of going to the beach and not just a day of bicycling to the countryside. Sunday is the biggest day of political campaigning in Germany. It's on Sundays when you went out with the flags and the uniforms. It's on Sundays when you beat up people. It's Sundays when train stations were crowded with all sorts of people coming back in the evening. Some are revelers, some are day trippers, some are communists, some are Nazis. This is a very complicated Sunday, but love's there. If you can't understand the commitments of all these people. First of all, some people kiss on Sunday and have a great time, but you can't understand the commitments of these activists Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, especially the Nazis, without considering a love. The idealism, what is impelling them to do this, and so this is a story about Sunday. You could call it the last weekend. It's a story about Sunday in 1930, Germany.
Well, I just wanted to well, I want to thank you so much. I wanted to share, you mentioned Tarawa. I wanted to share something that has to do with our post-aesthetic cultural world in the United States. It turns out that many of us, of course, are familiar with the schlocky director Ed Woods, who did all these B movies and C science fiction horror movies. Well, it turns out that at the Battle of Tarawa, he's in the Marine Corps. He is at Tarawa after the battle. And remember, there's what, 6 to 7,000 dead in a space that's one-third the size of Central Park. It's hot as hell. And he's sitting there policing the battlefield wearing a brassiere and panties. I mean, I just want to end on sort of a semi-humorous note, but here he is putting together and burying the dead. And what amazes me about that story is, okay, that'll have an effect on you for the rest of your life doing something like that. And here we see how this actually impacts on our popular culture into the present time. It shows you how the longevity of World War II can be in all sorts of unbelievably deceptive manners. But anyway, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your new book, 1942.
Well, thank you, friends and allies. Thank you.
Yes, and as I said to you before, I hope these guys actually read the book when they review it. All right. Thank you so much, Peter. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you very